Welcome to Everything on Everything. Today we are discussing The Godfather. Not him. Hendrik Frensch Verwoerd, also known as the Godfather, the architect, and the engineer of what we all know as apartheid. So what was apartheid? This was a system of institutionalized racial segregation that existed in South Africa from 1948 until the 1990s. Hendrik Verwoerd, born on the 8th of September in 1901 in Amsterdam, Netherlands. Second child to father Wilhelmus Verwoerd and mother Anja Skrik. In the early years of his childhood, his father, Wilhelmus, who was a shopkeeper and a devoted religious man, decided to relocate his whole family to South Africa in 1903. What was the reason for this? Well, he felt great sympathy for the Afrikaner nation in the wake of the Second Boer War. Verwoerd lived his toddler and teenagers in South Africa, and since he was such a brilliant scholar, he received major scholarships from basically everywhere. Must be nice. He completed his doctorate in psychology in 1925 at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, titled The Afstomping van die Gemoedsaandoeninge, which means the blunting of the emotion. He later left for Germany in 1926 to study under famous German psychology and philosophy professors of the time. He proceeded his research in psychology and sociology at the University of Hamburg, Berlin, and the University of Leipzig. He studied under William Stern, Wolfgang Kohler, and Otto Lippmann. Unfortunately, though, most of these professors were not allowed to teach anymore once the Nazis came into power. It was the Nazis, so step aside. There were claims that Verwoerd also studied eugenetics, which is basically the practice that aims at improving the genetic composition of the human race, in which this all happened during his temporary stay in Germany. This was the beginning of it all, because, shocker, get this, it is believed that his apartheid policy was based on the Nazi ideology. Yeah, I guess somebody became best friends with Hitler. Before returning to South Africa, Verwoerd was joined by his wife in Germany in 1927, where they got married. His wife, Elizabeth Verwoerd, who was also known as Bestie, originally of Danish descent, but born in Middelburg in the Cape Colony, South Africa in 1901, and later died on the 29th of February in 2000, literally 20 years ago. Verwoerd and his wife returned to South Africa a year later during the Great Depression. He became active in social work among poor white South Africans, devoted much of his attention to welfare, and often consulted by welfare organizations, also while serving on numerous committees. Let's just say the man did not have a sociology and psychology degree for nothing. I don't know if this is reverse psychology or manipulation. Moving on forward, in 1936, Verwoerd and some other professors from Stellenbosch University protested against the immigration of German Jews who were coming to South Africa to flee from all the terrible Nazi persecution. Look at them being all good citizens. In that same year, because of his efforts in the field of national welfare, it drew him into politics. Politics, of course, where he was offered the first editorship of a newspaper catalog called Die Transvaal, which aimed to promote Afrikaner nationalism and supporting the National Party. I know, right? A party had its own newspaper catalog, and it was a big deal back then because they didn't have social media like we have today in order to get their message across. They only had the newspaper, and did I mention that Verwoerd also had a degree in journalism? I guess they had the best of both worlds. The newspaper sure did work in their favor because, quite frankly, most black people didn't really know how to read, so the so-called right people read it. This paper helped support the opinions that most white South Africans had, that changes to the socio-economic system needed to be implemented. Well, here's a little bit more of some history. From 1901 to 1948, Afrikaans politics was divided between the liberals, who on one hand argued for the reconciliation with Britain, versus the extremists, who on the other hand had neither forgiven nor forgotten the British for the Boer War. Even though the extremists and liberals were against each other, they had something in common. They both strongly believed that South Africa was a white man's country. Different message, same outcome. Verwoerd was not a fan of the British, and he belonged to the anti-British segment in Afrikaner politics who wanted to keep as much distance from them as possible. But in 1939, Verwoerd protested against South Africa's role in the conflict when the country declared war against Germany. I guess it's safe to say birds of the same flock don't always fly together, and because of that, South Africa had to side with its former colonial power, the United Kingdom. See how funny life works sometimes? In 1948, the general elections were held, and the Nationalist Party and the Afrikaner Party won. This was the beginning of the National Party's domination. Well, more like the beginning of the end for South Africa, really. Running on the platform of self-determination and apartheid, as it was first labeled for the very first time. The Prime Minister Daniel Malan at the time was the leader of the National Party. Him and his party benefited from the support from the rural electorates. This led them to virtually kick other parties off their seats in Parliament. Interesting fact, Parliament to many South Africans is now seen as the new Comedy Central. Check it out if you haven't already. I promise you won't be disappointed. Most parties believed that the nationalist policies were responsible for the National Party's victories, and so Malan reinforced stricter policies for reservation policies that protect white people. He sure felt the need to protect the people that needed it the least. Great stuff, champ. Later in the year of 1950, Verwoerd was elected as the Minister of Native Affairs and served for 8 years before being appointed as Prime Minister in 1958. During his reign as Minister of Native Affairs, Verwoerd drew up some interesting laws like the Population Registration Act, the Group Areas Act in 1950, and the Pass Laws Act of 1952, which required that black people in South Africa over the age of 16 carry a passbook that was similar to a passport everywhere at all times when in a white dominant area. In other words, its aim was to basically encourage black people to stay in their own homelands. His other major laws included the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 1953 and what we would like to refer to as the Game Changer, also known as the Bantu Education Act. This act was enforced basically to keep the black people from becoming great. Its aim was to give them just a minor form of education, to make them feel better, I guess. In Verwoerd's words, the Bantu must be guided to serve his own community in all aspects, which this inferior education only ensured that black people could work as unskilled laborers. And just like all historic stories, of course there was a string of women that fought the system. You go, girls. As an example, Noma Venda Matlani specifically criticized and ridiculed Verwoerd for the Bantu Education Act. This sadly backfired and only caused generations of black South Africans to suffer an inferior education, which I think still affects black people in South Africa today because black people still get the lowest wage. Verwoerd further pushed the apartheid agenda as he continued to shape and implement apartheid policies, which he often described as a policy of good neighborliness. How thoughtful of him, don't you think? These policies were namely the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, the Bantu Investment Corporation Act, and the Extension of University Education Act. Yeah, he was clearly blinded by the goodness. When the National Party came to power in 1948, there were differences in the party about systemic racial segregation. The larger fraction favored and ruled for segregation, but also favored that black people be part of the economy, but only on one condition. That is, if they could be controlled by the Afrikaner economy. The second fraction called themselves purists. Why is this so? Well, they believed in vertical segregation where blacks and whites would entirely be separated, with blacks living in their own native reserves and having their own economy and political structures that would still leave white people in power and benefiting from black labor. Once again, different message, same outcome. I had a feeling. The National Party's long-term goal since coming into power was to create a republic. In doing so, they reached for the stars hoping they would receive Commonwealth while still being a republic. I bet you're wondering what Commonwealth is. It is basically a world organization of autonomous states that are united in allegiance to a central power. But let's understand that they are not subordinate to it, neither to one another, which in this case was the British Commonwealth, an association of nations consisting of the United Kingdom and several former British colonies that are now sovereign states but still pay allegiance to the British Crown. So this meant that South Africa became a state within the British Empire in 1934, but Verwoerd wanted to part ways with the British in 1960, and now pulled out the referendum that resulted in South Africa becoming a republic that we now know as the Republic of South Africa. I think I should run for president. Anyways, It also resulted in South Africa coming out of the British Dominion on the 31st of May in 1961. After South Africa became a republic, Verwoerd refused to accept any black ambassadors from Commonwealth state. We probably saw this coming. He ever so deeply, passionately refused to have any non-whites representing South Africa in sports such as cricket, which created a movement to exclude South Africa from international sport competitions. In 1976, South Africa was even expelled from FIFA, and wherever any South African teams participated in anything sports-related, it resulted in protests and disruptions. South Africa was really on their own. Now, all good things do come to an end. On the 9th of April 1960, the Union Exposition in Milner Park, Johannesburg, opened to mark the Jubilee of the Union of South Africa. An anti-apartheid activist, David Pratt, who was a businessman and a farmer, attempted to assassinate Verwoerd, firing 2 shots from a .22 pistol caliber at point-blank range, which one bullet hit Verwoerd's right cheek and the second hit his right ear. While still unconscious, Verwoerd was rushed to a nearby hospital immediately. His condition was stabilized, and it was confirmed that he was in a good enough condition to be moved to a proper hospital for more surveillance. I mean, he couldn't be the Godfather without having a target on his back, right? The assassinator, David Pratt, claimed that he did not want to kill Verwoerd, merely just to injure him. Should I call that courage, or should I call it insanity? Pratt was admitted to a mental hospital on the 26th of September in 1960 as a result of him not having the mental capacity to be criminally liable for shooting the minister. On his 53rd birthday the following year, he committed suicide even before his parole was considered. However, David Pratt was not the only one who wanted to assassinate Hendrik Verwoerd. It just so happened that 6 years later, on the 6th of September in 1966, the House of Assembly was about to convene on their afternoon session. Verwoerd was expected to make an important and much anticipated announcement on the new policy direction. Instead, the members of parliament gathered in shock as Verwoerd slumped forward onto his desk and died immediately. How, you ask? A man named Dimitri Tsafendas, a Greek-Mozambican political militant who was a lowly parliamentary messenger, assassinated Verwoerd by first pretending to say something to him, but ended up stabbing him at least 4 times before being overpowered by other members who wanted to help Verwoerd. His death shook the system as apartheid opponents were excited and saw this as a triumph for freedom in South Africa. Hendrik Frensch sure left a mark in South Africa, and as he once said, the Jews took Israel from the Arabs, and after the Arabs had lived there for 1,000 years. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state, and so he stood by these words. But folks, and that's the story and history behind the man that started it all in South Africa. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, and switch on the notification bar for more of our videos.